In the middle of the bloodiest conflict on Earth, something impossible happened. This is the true story of the Christmas Truce, and why the High Command made sure it never happened again. The silence of nitrogen monoxide man's LA&D the sniper adjusted his scope, centering the crosshairs on a flickering light in the German trench. It was Christmas em 1914 from Donger, but he didn't fire. Instead of a muzzle flash, a melody drifted across the frozen mud of Belgium. The Germans were singing Silent Night. This wasn't supposed to happen. Private Henry Williamson had been told the men across the wire were monsters. For months, he had lived in a ditch filled with rats and the stench of decaying friends. The orders from London were clear: kill or be killed. But as the sun set over the Ypres salient, the deadliest landscape on Earth went silent if Henry climbed out of that trench. He faced an immediate court-martial for treason or a bullet to the brain. Yet, a flickering candle appeared on the German parapet. Then a voice shouted in English, "You know fight, we know fight." The stakes were higher than just one life. If the soldiers stopped fighting, the entire machinery of the British Empire and the German Reich would collapse. The generals back in their warm chateaus knew this. They needed hate to keep the war alive. But on this night, hate was freezing over. Henry watched as a lone German soldier stood up. He wasn't carrying a Mauser. He was holding a small evergreen tree decorated with candles. A British officer hissed at his men to stay down. It was a trap. It had to be a trap. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Suddenly, a British private jumped up. He didn't ask for permission. He walked into no man's land, the strip of ground where thousands had died just days before. The officers screamed for him to come back. He ignored them. Then the impossible happened. A German soldier met him halfway. They didn't wrestle. They didn't stab. They shook hands. Within minutes, hundreds of men were pouring out of the trenches. These were men who had spent weeks trying to disembowel each other. Now, they were exchanging cigarettes. They were sharing photos of their wives. They were showing off buttons and tins of jam, but the atmosphere shifted when they looked down. The ground between the trenches was littered with bodies. Bodies that had been rotting there for weeks because the machine gun fire was too heavy to retrieve them. The truce turned into a mass funeral. Enemies picked up shovels and worked side by side. They buried each other's dead. They held joint services, reading the 23rd Psalm in both English and German. For a moment, the war was over. Then came the soccer ball. Someone found a leather ball, or perhaps a stuffed sack of hay. In the middle of a world war, a match broke out. It wasn't about countries anymore. It was about a score. It was about being human again. But the clock was ticking. Word of the fraternization reached General Headquarters. The reaction was instant fury. To the High Command, this wasn't a miracle. It was a mutiny. If the men realized they had more in common with the enemy than the generals, the war would end tomorrow. They couldn't allow that. Orders were dispatched immediately. Any soldier found speaking to the enemy would be shot for desertion. By the morning of December 26th, the mood changed. Artillery officers, who hadn't seen the faces of the men they were killing, were ordered to open fire. They were told to aim directly at the spots where the soldiers had shared tea the night before. That the pressure reached a breaking point. On one sector of the line, a German officer shouted over to the British, "We have been ordered to fire on you. Please, get your heads down." He fired his pistol into the air to satisfy his commanders. The British replied with a warning shot of their own. The cycle of violence was being forced back into gear by men miles away from the mud. The final escalation came on New Year's Eve. The commanders realized that if these specific units stayed together, they would never kill each other again. they began a massive reshuffling. Regiments were moved to different parts of the front. Men were replaced by fresh troops who hadn't shared bread with the enemy. The propaganda machine went into overdrive. The newspapers back home were told to suppress the story. The photos of the soccer match were confiscated. The generals needed the soldiers to see a monster in the crosshairs. Not a father of three from Munich. By January, the machine was back in full swing. The peace of Christmas was treated as a momentary lapse, insanity. Over the next 4 years, 9 million more people would die. The Christmas Truce showed the world that war isn't a natural state. It is a choice made by people who don't have to fight it, as Henry Williamson climbed back into his muddy hole. He looked at the German button in his pocket. He realized the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a bullet. It's a conversation. The generals won the war, but for 24 hours. The soldiers won the peace. Would you like me to research a specific historical figure from this event to create a follow-up story?